Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my round 2, day 2 overview and analysis video of MSI in 2025. We are continuing the train. We are rolling forward. Of course, we covered the first day of round 2 yesterday, where we had our first elimination series between FlyQuest and G2, and our first matchup to determine who makes winners finals between Gen G and Anyone's Legend. We have the other half of those matchups here today, our second elimination from round 1, and our second team to make winners finals by winning their round 2 matchup. And so still a lot on the line for both of these teams, and I am still very excited. If you are, let me know down in the comment section below, what did you expect from these two series here today? Did they live up to your expectations, or were you surprised by the outcomes? Always curious to know your thoughts and opinions down below, but let's go ahead and get into things. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go game by game in both of the series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Of course, again, we always take a look at the bracket at the end of every video, and we will be previewing the matchup that is happening tomorrow. Basically, from this point onwards, we're just going to be one series a day for the rest of the tournament, which makes things a lot easier, not only in terms of content creation, but in terms of, spotlighting and highlighting these big moments that are happening for these teams. But this will be our last doubleheader day, which means that we've got a lot to cover today, at least a lot more than we will the rest of the tournament. So let's get into it, shall we? Let's talk about the games that we got this previous day, and that kicked off with a pretty interesting series. We always start with the lower part of the bracket as we get into these days, which means it's an elimination series. The loser of this will be out of the tournament. The winner stays alive, and it's two, league-winning teams that really do not want to be one of the first two teams out of the main stage. It's the number 1 seed from the LEC in Movistar KOI, and it's the number 1 seed from the LCP in CTBC flying Oyster. And this is a very intriguing matchup because I think both of these teams have looked beatable, but also both of them have shown promise throughout this tournament. I think you can actually compare these two rather favorably against each other in the sense that I don't think they're really all that different in terms of skill set or in terms of skill level. I think it's really just about who ends up showing up on the day. KOI obviously losing in round number 1 to Bilibili Gaming is fine as a loss. I think BLG is a bit better than people are giving them credit for, but KOI is one of those teams that really needs to step up here today. I would say there's significantly more pressure on KOI than there is on the Oysters or basically anybody else in round number 2, because they kind of hold the weight of their entire region in their hands right now. G2 had looked incredibly shaky at this entire tournament. They looked quite bad in the play-in stage. They lost more games than they won in that stage, and then they make it to the main stage. They are able to kind of shockingly take a game 1 against a super jet-lagged Gen G, but after that, they get blown out by FlyQuest and are clearly the worst team in the main stage of the tournament. If KOI ends up going out as well in round number 1, if the two worst performing teams in the main stage of this tournament are both from Europe, that is a disaster for the region, and it really starts to bring into question just what level that region is at right now. Something that I've been raising all year long. Anybody who's watched the LEC this year can tell you the level of play has been incredibly low domestically. That is almost always the case, not to just dig on the LEC, but for some reason, the domestic play is always very shaky and very low, and then teams seem to figure it out when they go international. That has not been the case so far in 2025. Things have not really worked out for Europe. This is KOI's chance to kind of turn that around and to kind of make their claim that, yeah, G2 might not be the kings of Europe, but they're still are good teams from the LEC that can represent the region internationally. I think if you're looking at the ways that they're going to be able to do that specifically in this matchup, well, I think you're looking at Jojo Pune, right? There's no real other player that has to be able to step up and take over the game in the way that Jojo's going to have to be able to step up. He is the heart and soul of what KOI did domestically. He kind of was the determining factor with whether or not they won or lost games. When he would win in his mid lane matchup 1v1, generate big leads and be able to move around the map, this team was near unbeatable domestically. They really were that strong, and that's why they had such an easy time being able to win the LEC, because Jojo was in great form going into the playoffs. But when he would lose 1v1 and when he wouldn't be able to generate those leads, this team didn't really have an alternative playing style. It was something, honestly, I criticized them a lot for, and the reason I had them at number 4 in my power rankings for a large portion of the LEC split is they really have one way to play the game, which is pressure through the middle of the map. Now, that's a pretty consistent way for a lot of teams to win right now, because that's just the way the game has evolved. But Jojo really needs to step up here today and be better than Hongkyu. Honkyu's actually been awesome at this tournament. He's a player that I've really, sung the praises of in the past. I know he's had his inconsistencies domestically, but, the scout in me kind of looks at him and goes obviously there is a star in there, and I think I wouldn't be shocked if within a year, this is the best player in the region in the LCP by far. I really do think he has that kind of talent. He has to be able to beat Hongkyu today. If Hongkyu was just better, kind of like he was at times against Faker and T1 in that previous series, then I think things are going to be a big problem for KOI. I don't think they're going to have a lot of like actual answers to that. I think Supa and Alvaro also obviously kind of have to step up. Doggo and Kaiwing can be exploitable. Kaiwing in particular had a pretty bad series against T1 and I think is kind of the weak link of this team, especially when you talk about like the mechanics. And I think Alvaro looked awesome against BLG. Regardless of whether or not that team found any success, Alvaro was the one player that was actually trying to win the game for that team. He kept looking for positive plays and generally just had a really great series. If Supa and Alvaro can be the better bot lane, which I think is super reasonable, right? Like Supa, a pretty stable player, good in lane, good out of lane, kind of your jack of all trades, AD carry. Doggo, very much not that. He is very specialized in the 2v2, not a great team fighter, is constantly going to be out of position in the late game, but is really good at getting leads. Like if that can be in favor of KOI, if you can win early, especially if you're KOI, that is a big deal for the team. So Jojo, Supa, Alvaro, I think those are the players you're obviously watching out for. Elyoya has to be able to keep up with Junjia. I think Junjia is the better player right now, but Elyoya is good enough. And then Mirwin just has to survive on the top side. Driver is definitely the best top laner in this series, but as long as Mirwin isn't getting slammed, I think KOI can win these games. And then for the Oysters, I projected them to win this series. They were my favorites coming into this, which I don't think was the case for everybody, but I do think that there are a lot of things kind of to like about their matchup specifically against KOI. First and foremost, I think KOI is just not in a great mental spot, nor do I think they're particularly consistent. I think this is one of those teams that on any given day can just be the worst team at the tournament. That's just kind of how KOI operates, and the Oysters are significantly more consistent than that, and it's almost entirely because of Junjia in the jungle. I really do think this is a big advantage for CFO, maybe not like a gigantic one, because Elyoya is a good player, but Junjia is just in better form than Elyoya is right now, and jungle is way too important in the current meta to be significantly worse in the jungle position. So I think if Junjia can really get going, that is a big plus. And just as we talked about Jojo Pume being so important for KOI, it's really important for CFO to win in the mid lane. If Hongq can just shut down Jojo Pume, put him behind in terms of resources and tempo, especially on champions that are a bit more aggressive that he likes to pull out, then all of a sudden things look a lot better for CFO, and they should have a pretty easy time being able to win this. I think top lane matters. One of the big reasons why I was frustrated with CFO is because they probably should have beaten T1 if they had just played Driver in game number 5. I'm not saying that that would have solved every problem, but it certainly would have made things a lot more interesting in that matchup. I imagine Driver will get a lot more playing time now that he's not nearly as jet lagged. So the players to watch, jungle mid, I think is the most important role to watch, but bot lane also very important to make sure that KOI can survive. If Doggo just gets these big early laning phase wins off, I think Junjia is going to do a great job of being able to translate that into big successes. But the only way to know if my prediction of the Oysters 3-2 is going to come to fruition is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was the CTBC Flying Oysters. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0. They're going to establish a lot of tempo and a lot of pressure early, and honestly, this is not a good look from KOI. Not only were there a ton of individual mistakes in this game, some that just need to be prevented on the international stage, like they're just completely unacceptable, but this is a ginormous draft gap in favor of KOI, and to lose this game, I think is not great. I really don't think that's a good look. For CFO, I hate their draft. I think they give themselves very limited options in terms of how to win this game. You basically need Xin Zhao Ezreal to take over in the early game. Azir as your quote-unquote late game win condition only ever works if KOI is super far behind in gold, because they have significantly more damage in the back half of the game than one Azir is going to be able to output. That on top of the fact that I really don't think you win any of your lanes, like if you just look raw at the matchups, especially with something like Trundle moving around the map. This is one of those drafts where I came out of it like, oh, KOI's just going to win game number 1. Like, it's really tough for CFO to be able to win it, but KOI, again, screwed up a lot over the course of this game, which they are prone to do, and CFO is pretty stable, all things considered, when it comes to taking advantage of mistakes. This is a team that you can't just make a ton of errors against and expect them to kind of roll over and die. They're not that kind of team, even with a draft like this. So, I've already kind of talked about it. We always talk about draft first when we talk about these games, so let's get into it. The reason I think KOI's draft is just so difficult, or I guess, sorry, not difficult to beat, but rather so easy to execute on in comparison to CFO's, because really that's what it is, right? Is like KOI just has so many more win conditions than CFO does, is that I think you're looking at 3 lanes that individually, if you're just talking about how they interact with each other, I think KOI should be able to get leads in all of them. I think Rumble into Sion is a very good matchup for Rumble early. Not that Sion's going to get punished super hard, just that Rumble should have a gold advantage. I think Yone into Azir is definitely Yone favored. How does Azir ever trade with Yone with all of the healing and shielding that he's going to be able to do, especially especially after like level 3 or level 4. It becomes very difficult, in my opinion, for Azir to play that laning phase out. And Sivir's never going to be in range to ever actually have to do anything against Ezreal, especially because Ezreal has Leona in this lane. And so you can't really ever be aggressive. I think Sivir's going to have first rotation. Certainly is going to have more wave clear than anything Ezreal can offer. And so you're looking at all that, and I think Trundle is awesome in this game. Not only is it a great R3 because you had already seen the Scion, so you can steal those stats in the early part of the game, but I love Trundle into Xin Zhao just generally as a pick. I think that's one of Xin Zhao's hardest matchups in the current meta. This is just a draft where it's like, okay, Koi outscales because you're playing around Sivir Rumble late game. Yone can set things up. Alistair can set things up. Trundle basically takes away Scion's ability to tank in the late game. So, you know, CFO don't really have a great front to back, but also I don't really think CFO win any of the lanes either, and it really kind of requires Genjia to just be better than Elyoya in the early game. Unfortunately for Koi, they just screwed it up. Like, they lost these lanes that were winnable anyways. Their solo laners in particular were absolutely miserable in this game. I just talked about how Rumble and Yone should be able to win lane against, you know, Azir and Scion, because they absolutely should. I think everybody would agree that they should be able to win those laning phases, but they just didn't. Not only did Jojo lose, he got solo killed. Mirwin was down a ridiculous amount of CS, blowing flash randomly throughout the game. Like, it's just not good. It was a horrible look from these solo laners, and that opened up the floor for the rest of the Oysters to just step in and be a lot more consistent. CFO did a great job of capitalizing on those mistakes, but be aware, they were mistakes by Koi. That's exactly where this ended up drawing from. So, player of the game for me is going to go to Hongqiu on this Azir. Some of the great plays he made this game were him. Some of them were Koi, which we will obviously talk about. Shout out Alvaro. But Hongqiu was the most relevant player in this game, was the clear choice for player of the game in game number 1. Not only was he doing a ridiculous amount of damage throughout this entire thing, he gets that solo kill on Jojo Pyun on the top side of the map. Absolute disaster for Jojo, as Yone getting solo killed by Azir is just not acceptable really under any circumstance. That just can't really happen. And then obviously has the gigantic team fight ultimate at the end of the game. Not really entirely his doing. You know, Alvaro headbutting the Azir into the entire enemy team so that he can just shuffle them all backwards is not the perfect version of gameplay. I think that there certainly could have been some better moments from Alvaro, and we'll talk about that in this game. But Hongqiu still had to go out and deliver, and honestly, he was the most relevant player on CFO. I talked about it a lot. If Hongqiu's going to have a really good series, if he's going to step up and be better than Jojo Pyun, especially in lane, but even outside of lane as well, I don't think Koi has a chance. I think that is the pivot point of the entire series, and Hongqiu really showed up here in game number 1. B1 Azir gets counterpicked by the Yone and still just ends up winning the matchup. It doesn't really matter. So again, Hongqiu looking very good in game number 1. I do also want to give a big shout out to the rest of the top side as well. I think Junjia had a really solid game outside of the one time he got caught. You know, everybody gets one throughout every game of the bottom of the tournament, especially like the lower bracket. You can take one bad play and just kind of throw it out. But Junjia was really great outside of that in terms of the setups. I actually thought he did a lot better than his scoreline, his KDA would indicate here. Driver had a really solid game, although again, died in side lanes a couple of times. You could be a bit critical of his positioning, but they had to put a ton of resources into trying to kill this Scion really at any point, and oftentimes that was to the benefit of CFO, who was just getting things elsewhere on the map. Doggo and Kaiwing were totally fine, definitely the better of the bot lane duo, which we will talk about. Supa had a really good game, and I think he was really solid. In this one, it's just not enough, right? Like, CFO was just a little bit better. So, you know, that's kind of the general trend, right? Is CFO did a good job of not making egregious mistakes and just capitalizing on the ones that Koi did make to walk themselves to a game 1 win. And for Koi, I mean, this was super undisciplined. This was quite bad gameplay. Like, this was just really inconsistent stuff from them. We've seen this from them throughout a lot of this year domestically, where it's just trying too much, like trying too hard to play the game and just failing in a lot of concrete areas. Whoever you want to give dead of the game to, I think is kind of up to you. It should be one of Mirwin, Jojo, or Alvaro. All three of them really lost this game for Koi and basically made it unwinnable. Not that Elyoya was incredible, but just those three in particular were actually just horrendously bad. Alvaro's getting dead of the game for me because he made the most baffling play of the entire game, headbutting the Azir into his team and allowing every single member to get Shuriman shuffled. It killed Supa on the spot and basically ended the game immediately. Completely unacceptable play there from Alvaro, but I get wanting to go for something a bit more aggressive because nothing else was working on the Rift at that time. That being said, not the play, like not the one you should have been going for. So Alvaro getting dead of the game on one of his better champions, mind you, in the Alistair. Not his best, but the LEC has found a ton of success on things like Alistair throughout this year, and that's, you know, definitely not good to see him get slaughtered on it in game number 1. Same thing for Jojo. Like, his Yone has always been one of his best champions, certainly one of the ones he's felt the most consistent in picking throughout his career, and he looked awful on it in this this game. And that just happens sometimes with him. It's not the first time we've seen him play really bad on this champion. Sometimes he's whiffing ultimate, sometimes he's just lacking in team fight power. In this game, he was losing in lane and also wasn't really offering anything else anywhere. So, like, it was just a bad game. Jojo completely outplayed by Hongq. Mirwin, I don't even want to get into what was going on, ends up blowing Flash multiple times off screen. I really don't even know how that ended up happening. Shout out to the Rumble, like another matchup where it's like you got to be able to win it early, and he just wasn't able to do it. He is the weak link of Koi in terms of just actual raw mechanics, and I think that's coming out more and more. Hell, Yo-Yo was out jungled by Junjia, but, you know, not entirely his fault. He had some losing lanes throughout this one, which I will definitely say probably should not have been the case. And shout out Supa. Supa played a really great game. His positioning was really solid, and he had a chance to be able to carry this in the back half if they just gave him an opportunity to sit back there and team fight. Alvaro wanted to kill him, though, at every single opportunity, so Supa never really got to play the game. Koi looked really bad in game number 1. They have to turn things around going into game number 2, but if CFO can pick up that game 2 win, things are going to look pretty dire overall for Koi. So which one of those is going to be the case? Well, the winner of game number 2 was CFO. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, and they're going to do it in pretty dominant fashion. This is yet again just another game where they are better than their opposition. Were there mistakes made by CFO in this one? Yes. I do think that this was more up and down than game number 1 for them. I think that there were moments in game 1 where it felt like Koi was making their way back into it, but for the most part, Koi made a ton of mistakes, and CFO was pretty calm and calculated in being able to take advantage of those and just kind of push forward. A lot of the negative plays that CFO had weren't necessarily the worst plays in the entire world. I think this time, you know, Hongq had less of a dominant game in the mid lane, and that meant that things were a little bit more up and down, but Koi, very similarly, kind of drafted themselves into a position where they should have won the game and just didn't really have the firepower. Not every single pick here is something that I like. I want to make that clear, but once again, I do think that they have the slight advantage just in terms of the power that this comp has, especially in the early game, even if there are a couple of champions here that I'm not a fan of. So let's go ahead and get into it. I think it's pretty easy to talk about draft because it's the 2 phases of the game. Koi should obliterate this game in the early game. Like, there is nothing that CFO can do to match, like, Lee Sin moving around the map and then Caitlyn Karma down in the bot lane. Now, I want to make it clear, I hate Caitlyn in this game. I think this is a really bad situation to pick Caitlyn in. Not only do I think that the Jhin is going to be difficult to really take advantage of in the early game, the R5 Bard kind of turns off a lot of the aggressive plays that Koi wants to make in that early game. You know, Kaiwing obviously piloting it well. We'll talk about it. He had a very nice game here, but I think generally speaking, this comp absolutely needs something to do if this game goes longer than 10 minutes, because right now they just don't. Like, TF is going to move around the map once he gets level 6, and Lee Sin, Caitlyn, Karma, like, they can push advantages early, and yeah, you probably do have 3 winning lanes once again here, at least in isolation, but who exactly is scaling in this comp? Caitlyn is going to have to be the #1 damage dealer throughout the entirety of this game, and that's just too much responsibility to put on a Caitlyn when she has to deal with so many CC threats on the other side, and also so many health bars to end up breaking through, because not only is it Skarner on the front line, not only can Bard, you know, make anybody go invulnerable for a couple of seconds, but Shen ultimate is a big problem in this game as well, and so it's just a really difficult game to imagine Koi could ever team fight in, and I think that's kind of where they ended up landing. That being said, I still do prefer their draft, because again, in the early game, I don't really see how CFO gets to play, really under any circumstance. I don't think you're looking at any lane that's going to be able to, like, even do anything. Like, Jin's going to be able to survive. I like the bot lane Jin pick. I think it's pretty solid in this game, but outside of that, like, what's Rai supposed to do into Twisted Fate early on? He can't really fight him at any point. The Shen's not going to be able to lane against Mbessa, who's really good in the 1v1. Like, it just doesn't really feel like there's a lot of options for CFO. They need to scale, and that's exactly what happened here. They just played a little bit slower, and quite frankly, they just played better in the mid and late game, and that's kind of what separated them. So let's talk about it. Player of the game should go to one of 2 players. I landed on Driver in the top lane on this Shen. I feel like maybe he didn't have the biggest highlight plays. Like, Kaiwing had the biggest highlight plays in this game. I think that that's pretty clear on the Bard. His best plays were the best plays of the game, but I do want to say Driver was probably more consistent throughout this game, and so for me, you know, Kaiwing kind of screwing over that 3rd dragon fight and kind of being in a bad position because of it, that gave Driver player of the game, but you do still want to give a lot of credit to Driver. He is gapping Mirwin really hard in this matchup right now. Mirwin is just not holding up on the top side of the map. I don't even think this was entirely his fault. This was not a great Mbessa game, but it wasn't like a horrible Mbessa game from him. I just think Driver's better. Like, I really just think that it's clear that he has more self-awareness in terms of where he needs to be in the mid to late game, and especially when Mirwin feels like he has to be like a pivotal piece in Koi's success. I think that's when things kind of fall apart for the team, and Driver, I think, took advantage of that. Shen was taking support a couple of series ago, and I was really critical of it because I think it could have been something that shuts down things like Camille in the top lane. Here is the top lane Shen experience. This is much more valuable, in my opinion, than support Shen in the current meta, and I think Driver ended up proving that in game number 2. Also have to give credit to the bot lane. The bot lane was very good here. Kaiwing in particular with some unbelievable plays. Like I said, really was the playmaker for the team, the one with all the highlight plays that you're going to see in replays throughout all of game 2. And that's awesome because he is kind of the weak link from a player perspective. For him to step up and just be better than Alvaro so far in the first 2 games, that is a big difference-making thing for CFO. I did not expect that to happen. Quite frankly, I'm very surprised that Alvaro has been worse than Kaiwing, or at least less relevant than Kaiwing over the first 2 games, but that's hugely in favor of CFO. Doggo played this incredibly well. No real complaints. I really love Jhin in this particular matchup, again, specifically against something like Caitlyn. I think Jhin can be very successful because it's really hard to take advantage of him in the early game, and he's going to be useful basically no matter what, so like it doesn't really matter what happens with Caitlyn in the early game. Jhin is going to be able to do his own thing, and Doggo was awesome in the team fights, was, you know, super consistent, didn't really try to play hero ball, which I think is sometimes a big problem with him as a player. The only complaint I have for CFO is Hongq in the mid lane just dying in a couple of really bad situations, playing some fights quite poorly. Not the best Hongq game of all time. I think Ryze in general has looked a bit, you know, touchy at this tournament. The lack of range on that champion can cause you to be a little bit out of position in really important times and get caught out, but overall still more useful than the Twisted Fate on the other side, which we will talk about. But for Koi, pretty easy to kind of, you know, lead this discussion, if you will. They draft an early game comp that needs to win in their laning phases because Mbessa is not really going to be like a #1 carry. Caitlyn really falls off, and it's going to be difficult for her to get back online going into things like Jhin and Shen and Ryze because she's not going to have enough damage to break through them until very late in the game. And you already know how I feel about Twisted Fate. This champion is 0-7 at this tournament. I said in my meta report before a single game was ever played at MSI that this champion was bait, and I still believe that this champion is bait. He does no damage. His CC ability from a macro perspective is a bit overhyped because there are other champions that can do significantly more than TF can do, even if his timers are just slightly better. I just don't think that it's worth sacking, you know, what is generally an okay laning phase and like not good team fighting for, you know, a better macro ultimate. I just often think that that trade-off is not worth it, and I think that's what Twisted Fate offers you. You know, 0-7 I think is indicative of where his power level is. This champion cannot play the game right now, but he's not dead of the game. That's going to go to Elyoya. What a miserable game from Elyoya. He ended up playing this really poorly. Not only was he consistently out of position in the mid to late game because he's Lee Sin, and that's just generally how it goes, but his early game just wasn't good enough. You have to win early if you are Koi in this game. You have to have a lead going into the mid to late game, and he just didn't do anything in the early game. The plays that he did go for were quite awful. He was losing fights that he had no business being at in the first place. Like, just felt really bad for Elyoya. Elyoya and JoJo both played really bad in this game, and both of them kind of deserved out of the game. Supa and Alvaro were basically useless. Both of them end up getting absolutely destroyed on the bottom side of the map. The Caitlyn Karma ends up not working out. Again, I hate Caitlyn in this draft, and I would have told you that before, but it is what it is, right? Like, Koi just keeps putting themselves in positions where they have to execute at a really high level early on in games and take these winning lanes and transition that into success. They're just not doing it. Like, they're just not good at doing it, clearly. CFO is just outplaying them in the individual 1v1s, and their players right now are just better, and that's a big problem for Koi because now they're down 0-2 in this series. If they get swept in the same way that G2 got swept in the lower bracket, I mean, we're talking about EU having the worst tournament they've ever had. It's already on the table because they're down 0-2. They basically have to win this series or else EU is, you know, certainly not in a great spot, but they have to do that by starting with game number 3. If they can't win game 3, they're not just losing, they're swept out. So, giant game for Koi just to prove that they can win something. And for CFO, this team consistently overperforms expectations, and they're one game away from moving on to round number 2 here, to lower bracket round 2, which is huge for this team. And so, this would be a big win for them. Can they pick it up? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Movistar Koi. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to stay alive in this series at the very least for one more game, and they're going to do it in pretty great fashion. Maybe the most dominant game of the series. Up until this point, they are able to just very cleanly take game number 3 after really kind of committing in the draft phase to saying, screw it, we're going to go for something that everybody else has been too scared to go for. We're going to go for the Aurelia top lane as a counterpick to Yorick. Obviously, this has been talked about over and over and over again by many analysts all year long because, you know, theoretically, theoretically, you know, Yorick should not be able to play into Aurelia. And it's one of those things that, yeah, in isolation, that's 100% true. There's really no way to play the Yorick matchup, you know, if you are just isolated in the top lane. But there are counters to Aurelia in the late game and in the mid game that make it a little bit more volatile, we'll just say, in professional play than it might be in solo queue, because you can't just guarantee that you're going to be able to shut down this Aurelia over and over and over again in solo queue the same way you would be able to in pro, because you can just put a ton of resources into making sure she doesn't win the game for Koi. But luckily for Koi, she does win the game, quite frankly, for the team. She completely shuts down the Yorick. This counter pick works absolutely brilliantly, and from that point onwards, Koi plays really well to be able to control the map and just kind of take over the rest of the game from there. So we can talk about draft a little bit. Obviously, the Aurelia into Yorick matchup is what everybody's kind of thinking, but, and this might be controversial, because again, I've seen very other takes on this online. At least, you know, the European community is consistent in this regard. This is my least favorite Koi draft of the series up until this point. I really do think that you're kind of ceding a lot of pressure. Specifically, I just don't really know how you scale. Like, it really is up to Aurelia in the top lane whether or not you're going to be able to play this game. You're putting so much pressure on Mirwin to win and to not get ganked over and over and over again. And Oyoya, honestly, has a lot of pressure in this game to actually enable the Aurelia and also make sure the Xayah is in a spot where she can team fight in the late game. Now, all of those things did happen because Koi is a good enough team to be able to make it work, but I think this is a pretty hard win condition, all things considered. I think CFO's is much easier, which is to say, who cares if Yorick gets blasted on the top side? We have Aurora, we have Kai'Sa, we have Nocturne, Rakan for engage in the later part of the game. We don't actually really need Yorick to take over this. He's more of a distraction in a side lane that can allow us to play 4v4, and if Aurelia is winning and isn't able to make a lot of these fights, or even best case scenario, Aurelia is just kind of doing okay, and then you're team fighting against Xayah with Rel Poppy as the front line, like, you just win that game if you're CFO. So ironically enough, I think this is my favorite CFO draft of the series, and yet they still were going out there and losing it. That being said, the top lane counter pick really worked, and it ended up becoming a 5v4, and everybody else on the map also kind of lost, and that was really the big game changer there. But for me, player of the game kind of has to go to Mirwin. As much as he did make mistakes and he wasn't perfect throughout this game, the Aurelia was the main character of game number 3, and I think giving it to anybody else would be a bit of a mistake, at least from my perspective. I do believe that, you know, Elyoya maybe played a better game, all things considered. Elyoya was really solid in this, but Mirwin was the one that they were focusing on in terms of, you know, the in-game players playing the champions, and, you know, that's why he's getting player of the game. He was the main character. And then, you know, again, Elyoya maybe performed a bit better. He controlled the map really well, had some really nice plays, specifically in the early game to shut down Doggo early on in the game, and then obviously to kind of just completely control what Junjia and Hongkyu are able to do in the back half of the game as well. Poppy's just an Omega pick in this meta right now. I don't really understand why teams are just not early picking this in almost every draft. I feel like Poppy does well in almost any team comp, in almost any role, whether it's top lane, whether it's support, whether it's jungle. It honestly does not matter. The champ just does everything right now, and I think we kind of saw that once again. I know that you picked it on B2 because you didn't want to have to play Aurelia into Poppy, and that makes a lot of sense, but Poppy is good regardless, and Elyoya did a great job controlling the map and kind of setting the tempo for that. Jojo had a couple of mistakes early. I think died twice in lane, once or twice, I'm trying to remember. I believe he died twice in lane on the Taliyah to give Hongkyu some gold, but ended up playing the rest of the game about as well as you can on Taliyah. Like, this was just a really solid game. He's always been good in the mid to late game on this champion. That kind of goes against maybe what you would expect from him as a player and his playstyle, but it worked out. Sup and Alvaro were finally the better AD carry and support duo in this game. That's, you know, a long time coming. That probably should have been happening earlier on in the series, but at least it happened here. Koi, again, just being able to execute really well. This was an Elyoya game, and obviously playing around Mirwin and Jojo controlling the map. You know, that's the positive for Koi. They took a harder win condition and won anyways because they were able to get it. And then for CFO, like, Rest was just horrible. He gets put in midway through a series and almost always loses. I don't even understand why you put him in at this point. I understand that there's a lot of talk about, like, oh, you know, the LCP just loves their 6th men and are going to do it no matter what. Like, they just want to, you know, try and take advantage of it in Fearless, but Rest is, like, clearly a worse player than Driver in basically every aspect. Not only that, but Rest is a carry player, whereas Driver is a lot more versatile in terms of how things end up working out. Driver is just better in every aspect of the game, and Rest, you know, kind of got punished here. Again, Yorick blind is something that people can take advantage of in one way or another. Things like Cho'Gath were still up on the board as well, and so it's not like Yorick is unpickable against right now, but Rest just played it horribly, was taken out of the game, and is done of the game. It's not particularly close. I also think Junjia just wasn't very good in this game on the Nocturne. Noc's pretty hard to play from behind, and I get that that's just, like, naturally a situation, but really not ideal gameplay from him. Hongkyu did nothing after laning phase. Aurora has looked incredibly broken throughout this tournament, and yet the damage was not coming through. And Doggo's scoreline is a complete lie. He ends up like face-checking Tribrush down earlier on in the game, getting caught out and basically getting set behind a full level for basically the entire game. He never really got to recover from that. So for CFO, like this is just one of those, it was game 3 and you were up 2-0, you got counterpicked on the top side, oh well, like it happens. Maybe your win condition's a little bit easier to execute on because all you need to do is hope and pray you go into the late game neutral. But Koi ended up actually generating a lead for the first time in this series and doing something with it, which is not normal for EU teams, but at least they got a game here, you know, shout out to them. And who knows, maybe the reverse sweep is incoming. Game number 4 is now much more interesting. If Koi can come back and win game 4 now, all of a sudden you're sitting at 2-2 going into a Silver Scrapes game 5, and those first 2 games do not matter anymore. You have to be able to pick up that win. So for CFO, I think you need to kind of close this out in 4 games or else you're getting nervous. And for Koi, they have found their way back into the series based off a counter pick and some bad gameplay from CFO. Are they going to be able to take advantage of it? Well, the winner of game number 4 was CFO. They are going to take game number 4. They are going to take this series 3-1, and they will be moving on to lower bracket round 2 to take on the LPL's Anyone's Legend. A very exciting matchup between those 2 teams that's upcoming in just a couple of days here. I think it's actually tomorrow that series ends up happening, but for Koi, unfortunately, no more games for them at MSI. This is the end of the road, not only for them, but for Europe in general as a region, as G2, of course, goes out yesterday in their matchup against FlyQuest. Pretty horrible performance from the LEC. I can't really say that I'm super surprised. I don't think anybody was really expecting a ton out of the LEC coming into this tournament. There's been some holdouts in the community that have kept saying that the LEC is good, and I think that, you know, for a long time already, they've kind of been proven to not be correct, just from an international perspective. Do I think this region is worse than the LCP? No, I don't think that. I think they're clearly, in my opinion, at least at the moment, the 4th best region in the world. Because they're deeper, you know, outside of CFO, nobody else in the LCP is, like, good enough to take down EU teams regularly at the very least. Shout out GAM. Maybe Talon can eventually get there because they have too much talent to not be able to do that. But for now, like, they are definitely not where North America is at, and I think that that's probably a disappointing result for Europe, all things considered. But before we jump into, like, the full implications of just what this matchup ended up meaning in general for both of these regions, let's actually talk about what happened in game number 4. Once again, I see a lot of people talking about draft. I get it. Like, Europe does this every year. I love you European fans. I think you guys are very smart and you think about the game very critically, and I know a lot of this comes from the streamers that you watch because a lot of the popular European streamers just talk about draft. That's just kind of how it goes, but I'm sorry, like, this is not one of those series that you just insta-lost on draft. Like, you just got outplayed. There's really not a lot else to talk about, in my opinion. Like, there are draft things. Like, did you ban Gragas, Jax, Ornn, and leave up Cassante? Yes, you absolutely did that, and, you know, Driver's champion pool is a little bit limited, but it's certainly not that limited, and honestly, he's not the one player on this team that I would be targeting champion pool-wise. That's Kaiwing, who doesn't really have a champion pool down in the support position outside of the main engaged supports. He doesn't really play a lot of things down there, and so I probably would have been targeting him, but you do ban out 3 top laners and leave up the Cassante. Really not ideal. And then outside of that, like, what else? What are you going for here? Like, once again, I think the drafts got worse. I think game 1 and game 2, they were in winning positions. Game 1 especially, it was just such a dominant draft from them. For them to lose that game, I think, is really disappointing. Game 2, you know, I don't love the Caitlyn, but I do think you have so much pressure early that there's really no excuse for you not having a gold lead. Game 3, I do think CFO was ironically in favor in that one, just in terms of how their draft went. And I think, once again, it's just easier for CFO to execute this draft. I do, once again, think there are things that Koi did right. I think R5 Aurelion Sol does make some sense in isolation. And I say that because I think Aurelion has a really good matchup into Victor. I think he's in a spot where he should be able to scale relatively effortlessly. The only thing I really hate about this is, like, who's helping Aurelion in the late game? Like, it's literally just get him fed and hope he can 1v9 because you don't have any other champion that's going to be relevant in that phase of the game going into Victor Aphelios. It's not like you're ever going to outscale with whatever R5 pick you end up going for, and so, you know, you're picking Aurelion to win lane, which just feels a little bit weird. And then I also like the Renekton on the top side, I think, as an answer to Cassante. I think that's actually something that's relatively consistent. I think the Vi also helps with that quite a bit, but really, when you're looking at Koi for the 4th time really in a row, you're looking at a team that needs to win early, that needs to generate a lead, and specifically needs to get gold on a priority target, in this case, Jojo Pune on the Aurelion Sol. And for CFO, for the 4th game in a row, you're looking at a team that has a ton of outs in the late game, has a lot of ways to be able to play, team fights in the back half of the game, but might struggle to get there, outside of the Aphelios, who I think is actually going to have a relatively easy time getting there, all things considered, going in to Kalista Renata. And for CFO, they just executed it better. Again, like, I don't want to make it out to be like a draft diff. I really don't think that that's accurate towards how this series went. I think Koi played worse than CFO, and I think that was very clear here in Game 4. A couple of really great performances from CFO, player of the game and player of the series, is going to Driver in the top lane. He played 3 games, and they won all 3 of them. He's player of the series, and he was a big deal in Game 2. He was a big deal in Game 4. Do I think it's guaranteed that he's player of the game here? No, I think you could give it to Doggo on the Aphelios, who was just bursting people by the end of this game. I think Aphelios is very much not a good champion right now, but if you give him a ton of resources, yeah, he still can blow people up. It's not like he's not a burst AD carry that can, destroy people with ultimates and, win team fights with the right guns, but I just don't think he's particularly consistent. I think there's a lot of lanes that shut down something like Aphelios early, and I think it requires a very good support in order to make it work. Kaiwing, I think, had a really nice game, but Junjia also just has to be shouted out. Gigantic jungle gap, really across this entire series, but specifically in games 2 and 4. I think that's where it really felt like, oh, Junjia's just better than Elyoya. We kind of already knew that going into this series, but I guess it was good to get it proven right. But Driver really was the one that I think made the biggest difference. Like I said, banning out Gragas, banning out Jax, banning out Ornn, and yet leaving up Driver's Cassante, not really the best of circumstances, not really exactly what you want to see. And Driver's really proving himself to be one of the scarier top laners left at this tournament. I know that Mirwin is kind of a pushover, like, he's not very good. He's the weak link of that team, but Driver, embarrassed him in this series throughout quite a lot of it, especially in that game number 1. So, for him to have such a profound impact overall on the series, it's just a really big positive for CFO, and it shows that they really do have something here. Honkyu's the one player that continues to make mistakes. I do think he's just stepping too far forward. I don't think they're unfixable mistakes. I think it's clear that he's an 18-year-old. I think it's clear that he just wants to, he sees his team up 2 or 3k gold, and he's like, well, why can't I just fight all the time? And then he steps a little too far forward and gets caught. It happens every once in a while. I also think the Victor's not really all that great into what Koi drafted in particular. Again, the Asol on R5 I think is actually really positive. It's hard for Victor to deal with that champion, and, Asol is generally going to outscale, even if Victor has an easier time because of his teammates in this game. But, Honky really the only player making any sort of stumbles, and even then, they weren't game losing or anything like that. CFO just looks super stable. Honestly, do I think this team is maybe around top 8 or 10 in the world? Yeah, I think it's reasonable to say that, and Koi is just not at that level right now. CFO deserves the credit, and Koi honestly deserves some of the hate. I wish I could sit here and kind of give them, a pass for some of this, but I honestly think they were just outplayed. They're not as good as the Oysters. I think that is abundantly clear. We always knew this was going to be a low floor team, but the floor kind of fell out from under them. We got to be entirely honest on that. Elyoya is going to get dud of the game for me on the Vi. I mean, where was the jungle pressure? We talked about it in draft, when we kind of went over these two's draft, but you kind of have to win in the early game if you're Koi here because you're playing Renekton, Vi, Kalista, Renata. I get you just tacked on an Aurelion Soul, and, you're like, oh, well, we have scaling now. It's not really how that works. You don't really have any way to set up the Asol in the late game, and so Vi has to be aggressive. Vi has to actually do things in this game. Specifically, Vi has to make sure Victor and Cassante don't get out of control, because those are the 2 champions that are going to be very difficult to deal with in the back half of the game. Aphelios, it's going to be more difficult to punish just because of the Thresh throughout a lot of this, but if you can get Victor really far behind and get Aurelion really far ahead, I think that's your biggest win condition. And also, you need to make sure that Renekton actually does win on the top side. You need to make sure he's going to be a threat in order to threaten the backline in the later half of this game, because you have no other backline access, at least consistently, outside of Vi, who's going to get destroyed in these team fights. And so, I just think all of that needed to happen, and Elyoya did basically none of it. So it just kind of is what it is. Elyoya was not the better jungler in this series, and that's a bit unfortunate. Mirwin also kind of got destroyed on the top side. That's less surprising, definitely. Mirwin's just not a player I've ever really believed in. I put him as the number 9 top laner going into this tournament, and honestly, he played up to that. He was worse than Driver in my rankings, and he's worse than Driver in terms of his execution. I think it just is what it is. Jojo also just did not have a good series. Alvaro did not have a good series. Supo was the only one who even tried to exist today, but even then, it's not like he had a great game 4 or anything like that. It was just kind of lost for Koi. Entirely frank, they're just not as good as CFO, and I think that is what it is. I wish I had more to say, but right now, Europe's in a bit of a crisis of confidence. I tweeted this out. I think it was Jat who tweeted out, hey, what do you think is the reason for EU's underperformance? at MSI this year. And my response was something along the lines of, well, G2's gotten away with kind of being really bad at macro and generally being a very sloppy team for a very long time because they are way better than everybody else. And now that G2 has gotten worse and a lot of those players have been dispersed to other teams, nobody's really stepping up to kind of take that crown. It was always kind of a one-team region the past couple of years, and so it hid some of the flaws, but that one team isn't, dominant anymore, and now everybody's just as good as like Fnatic was last year, and that's really not a great place for them to be. Everybody is trying to chase being G2 instead of, trying to actually be good internationally. And I think they have more than enough talent to figure it out. There are great players in Europe, and honestly, Europe's a pretty deep region, but the talent is very spread out across a lot of the top teams, which makes the domestic league a lot more interesting, but it makes their international performances a little worse. And then also, the region just is kind of bad in terms of macro. Like, generally, like, they're not really great at thinking about the game. I talked about this, on Twitter and in the pre-tournament coverage. EU is, like, really far behind in terms of drafting right now, just across every other region in the world. They have been all year long. They've constantly been putting themselves in really bad positions in draft and just tried to outplay them in terms of their hands. And I think that just doesn't work anymore. Like, whatever's going on in EU scrims is clearly not, like, good because they're not on the same page as a lot of the other regions in terms of what is good and what is not, or how to draft in this current meta, how to play the map in this current meta. It just feels like the region is a little bit behind right now. I think they're more than good enough to be able to fix this year. Like, even going to Worlds, if there's one or two teams that go to Worlds and actually do well, I'm not going to be all that surprised. But right now, as we speak in July, like, this region does need some things to change. Like, they have to go out and, like, really improve in a couple of key areas. So hopefully they're able to do that, because this was a pretty embarrassing showing at MSI. And then for the Oysters on the other side, again, great win. Happy they're moving on. It's probably the last one they get at this tournament because they're running into the LPL champions right now. But this still was a really good showing, from the Oysters. And I think they've proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that first stand was not a fluke, that this is not just a random team. This is genuinely a very good team that you have to be scared of at an international level. Then moving on to our second series and going back up to the winner's bracket here, we get the one that I think a lot of people were waiting for. This was not quite the number 1 versus number 1 matchup we got yesterday in upper bracket, but it's the number 2 versus number 2 of the two biggest regions in the world. It's the number 2 seed from the LCK in T1 taking on the number 2 seed from the LPL in Bilibili Gaming. And obviously, this is a very interesting matchup because for large portions of this year, neither of these teams looked poised to make an international tournament. That really is just kind of how things were going. This, of course, happens every year to T1 in particular. Just as a team, they'll come out of the regular season somewhere between 9 and 11 wins and somewhere between 3rd and 5th place in the regular season standings, and then randomly go on a run to finals, get top 2, and make their way to an international tournament. It's just how things go with T1. At this point, I've stopped trying to use regular season tape as a way to contextualize them in particular. For every other team in the world, it does work. Like, I promise. Sometimes when you watch somebody play 1,000 games versus when you watch them play 10 games, the 1,000 game sample size is better. I assure you that is definitely usually something that works. For T1, I've just had to throw it out the window because this team randomly starts to get good when it's time to qualify for something international. Obviously, Riot loves that. It makes them a ton more money when T1's at international tournaments, but hopefully T1 can actually live up to the billing this time around. Again, this team has not been perfect throughout this year. I think a lot of people are just overestimating what T1 has been because they are T1 and because they are at this tournament and because they, beat Hanwha Life in such convincing fashion. But quite frankly, that series was an outlier. Like, they were getting destroyed by both of the top 2 teams in the LCK in the regular season, and a lot of that was off the back of a lot of these players just being inconsistent, specifically the bot lane being very inconsistent for them. Guma and Keria took some time to really get going so far in 2025. Owner's been hard carrying them through a lot of the regular season. Doran's had some great team fights and some great late games, but is not a particularly good laner, at least with the way that T1 wants to play around his top lane status. And Faker's been consistent, but not necessarily like standout. Like, he's been a top 4 or top 5 mid laner in the LCK, somewhere around there, just kind of depending on how much you want to give a sample size to Showmaker, who was so dominant in winter. Definitely better than Faker, but Faker was definitely better than him in spring. One of those things, right? But like, he wasn't top 3 in terms of LCK mid laners, and so it's just difficult to really get a grasp on T1 because you can expect all of these players to kind of level up at least like half a tier going into an international tournament. It's just kind of how it works. Maybe Faker jumps up even more because he always does going into MSI or Worlds or whatever, but BLG is also one of those teams that's really hard to get a grasp on right now because they're another team that really didn't look like they were going to be making MSI for most of this year. They end up swapping junglers. As you guys know, you know the story. Wei gets benched, Beichuan comes in from Thunder Talk, and things kind of turn around for this team. They get a lot more consistent in playing the macro game. They allow Knight and Bin to kind of really unlock themselves and start playing like their superstar selves again. Even if Beichuan in particular is not like pushing the games forward, he has his own set of problems mechanically speaking. Really what his introduction has done is allow the actual good players of this team to be the main characters rather than Wei, who really wanted a lot of the resources when he was playing for BLG. And I think that's opened up what their opportunities are in terms of how they play these games. But the problem is they're also very one-dimensional. We talked about this a bit earlier with someone like Koi, where they really have one way that they like to play the game. They want to win through the middle of the map. You know, Jojo Pyun and El Yoya wanted to push forward. Well, Bilibili have one way to win the game, and it's just skill gapping in lane. It's winning lanes and then winning the game. Like, that is their strategy, is just being better than their opposition, specifically having players like Knight and Bin up in XP and in resources a lot going into the mid to late game, because quite frankly, their team play, like their team fighting, is just bad. It's not really all that good. It's some of the weakest at this entire tournament. It just doesn't really matter because their players are so individually skillful. I still think there is an argument that maybe outside of Gen G, but maybe even including Gen G, like there's not a more talented team from a hands perspective in the world than Bilibili Gaming, and their ability to generate leads consistently inside lanes, you know, early on in games. Like, it's really, really strong. It's just, if they can get past that early phase of the game and not have this gigantic lead, if you can survive that early part of the game against a team like BLG, it's really difficult for them to do anything else because they're just not very good in the later half of the game. And so I think it's really important for BLG in particular to really push the tempo and win early because they're not going to beat T1 in a game of inches. But T1's also one of the more aggressive teams at this tournament in terms of how they played specifically this year. And so if they're pushing tempo as well and just trying to go hands for hands against BLG, I'm not sure that's a strategy that they can use to actually win the game. I think it's going to be up to T1 to slow the pace of the game down, play a lot more for coordinated late game plays, especially front to back 5v5s, where I think they are just individually better. And I think specifically if a player like Owner can get big leads in the jungle over someone like Beichuan, which he should be able to do, then it should be in favor of T1. That being said, I trust the hands of BLG a lot, and I don't know, for some reason it was just kind of calling to me. So my prediction in this series was BLG 3-2. I really do think that despite everything I've just said, BLG is going to be able to get some early leads and they are going to be able to push it forward. I think Knight and Bin are the two best players on the Rift in this series, and what I think that means is that it's really tough for me to imagine a world where they don't generate their own leads. Bin is good into Doran. I think Knight's going to be fine into Faker as he was in World Finals last year, even with Faker being really good in those team fights. And even with Owner being over Beichuan, I think that there is enough going for players like On and Elk right now that BLG is going to be good enough to push forward. But that was my prediction. Again, I don't think it's like a blowout in either direction. We'll have to see which direction it does end up going in. The only way to know is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was T1. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0. And honestly, game 1 went just about exactly how you could imagine a matchup between these two teams would go if T1 actually had the playbook and the game plan going into it, which is BLG did a pretty good job of generating some early leads. You had moments from players like Bin and players like Elk that looked really good. Elk started this game like 3-0 on the Kalista, and you felt like you were in a pretty decent spot, but the problem is they just had no way to close games. They misplay a couple of really crucial fights in the back half of the game, and T1 with some really awesome macro decisions and just general positioning ends up being able to come out on top regardless of, you know, what ends up happening in the early game. Again, you could have predicted the exact way that this game number 1 ended up going down just based off the play style of these two teams, but it's nice to see that they both are relatively predictable. Let's go ahead and get into draft. When you're looking at BLG's draft, it's kind of carried by the fact that they have a lot of the quote-unquote power picks in the meta. It's the Talia on B1, it's the Poppy on B3, which I really love in this draft. It's Kalista Renata in the bot lane, even something like a Sion that's really kind of become the top laner at this tournament so far. You're, you know, really expecting a lot of these players to step up and be able to show why these champions are having so much success. And then for T1 on the other side, it's kind of the opposite. They have a couple of things going for them, but I don't think it's nearly as consistent in terms of being able to create their own action in this game. Pantheon is going to have a lot of responsibility in the early game because you're looking at something like Yorick in the top lane, something like Jhin in the bot lane that aren't necessarily going to dominate their own lanes in the same kind of way. I think T1 does scale, obviously, because you have Orianna, Yorick, like even Jhin over something like Kalista, they should have a lot more of an easy time actually playing late games, and BLG has basically no scaling. They have no damage going into the later part of the game. You have ways to play team fights because, again, everybody kind of expects Taliyah to be a primary damage dealer in these fights, except for me, in terms of how these things are drafted, and Knight is obviously a player that maybe you would actually trust to do primary damage on something like Taliyah, but you don't really have a way to team fight if you're BLG in the back half of the game, and so you're trying to push that tempo, but the problem is Taliyah has to get out on the map and has to be able to do things. While Knight was trying in this game, his jungle wasn't really allowing him to do that. The Poppy wasn't relevant really at any point in this game, and not only was Poppy not relevant, but he misplayed. Beishuan was, doing some really head-scratching decisions throughout this one and really kind of showed why he's considered the weak link of BLG. I'll be entirely honest on that. We start with T1. We start with the winning team as per normal when we talk about what actually happened. Faker is player of the game. I mean, really, when you're looking at how this went, the Faker global taunt is back, baby. Like, we live in an era, again, where Faker is just going to be targeted for every single thing on the map, and he is going to punish teams for it because, and I've said this for a long time, Faker might not be, like, the best offensive player in the mid lane ever. He's not the kind of guy that's going to 1v9 carry. That's not what he's been over the last, especially like 5 years of his career. What he is probably the best defensive mid laner of all time. Like, his ability to survive in basically any situation is just better than almost any other mid laner that you're going to run into at a pro level. Like, his ability to just not die and to allow enough time for his team to be able to collapse on any play made on him in a side lane or in the jungle or wherever he's caught out, quote unquote. Like, it's unreal. His ability to draw attention and pressure and be able to punish it is better than anybody who has ever played League of Legends, and that is still the case. And you gave him one of his best champions here in Orianna, something he's really allowed to be defensive and more passive on. It's just a really bad recipe. He then goes for the Faker flank at the end of the game and ends up in a position that he has no business being in. The fact that nobody was covering that end flank around the top lane was absolutely ridiculous, but he ends up blowing up the game from there. Faker was awesome in game number 1, and this is what I'm talking about. He wasn't playing like this domestically. This is the Faker international buff. This is just basically what always happens when this guy goes international. He just starts playing better than he ever was domestically. I'm not sure if that's the wrist injury, him just taking it a little bit easier in the LCK, or if it's just, him, mentally locking in, just being a clutch player like we know he is, but it's very fun to see. And it wasn't just him. I thought Keria had a great game on Nico. A couple of those Nico ultimates were genuinely, like, game-breaking. He's been a lot better on Nico here at this tournament than he was domestically as well. And he was pretty good at it in the playoffs, in the quote-unquote playoffs, the road to MSI, whatever you want to call the LCK, best-of-5 stage. He was pretty good at it there as well, but it took him some time to get used to playing Nico, I think, in the support position. Nice to see him really, perform well. Guma was awesome in these team fights. Never really had to be a primary carry option, but was basically perfect in terms of his actual execution throughout this game. He's been very good at this tournament so far. Owner was solid, definitely better than Beishuan, and we'll get to that on the other side. The only kind of holdout here was Doran. Doran, of course, typing top gap into the end game chat, because what happened here? Like, Doran was not useful. This Yorick was, completely behind, and it didn't matter. This was basically a 4v5 for T1, and they won it anyways because they were ahead everywhere else. So congrats to them. Great game from Faker. If he can keep that up, it is going to be doomed because Knight is so integral to what BLG do. And, for BLG on the other side, you don't want to see them throw in game 1. That's already a bad omen, we'll just say, for the rest of the series for BLG fans, because this team needs to be able to hold on to their leads and actually end games. That's the thing they're really bad at, is ending games. And to see them once again have a lead, not do anything with it, and lose the game because they're positioned poorly and they team fight worse than the enemy, not a great look, not something that encourages me a ton, and I think there are a lot of things you can point to here. Dud of the game is obviously Beishuan in the jungle. This was a horrible game number 1 from him. Poppy is a very strong pick. I've called it kind of an Omega pick throughout a lot of this tournament so far because I think it just shuts down so many of the good carries and champions in the game in general right now, but Beishuan looked like he had never played Poppy before, even though we know that that's not the case. The play that really stands out to me, and I'm sure stands out to a lot of people, is Bin and Beishuan collapsing on Faker in the top lane, and Bin, lining up the Scion Q that if it hits Faker, it knocks him up. He's like instantly dead. And Beishuan, of course, for his part, shoulder checks Faker out of the Scion Q, and he just gets to walk away and live. It's one of those plays where it's like, the only thing I can say is it's very clear that this is Beishuan's first ever international experience, and certainly his first time ever playing T1, and he must be nervous out of his mind, because that's not a play that a reasonable human being makes, and even he is too good to make that play. This is just one of those things that happens because because the pace of the game is going too fast for you. You're nervous and you're freaking out a little bit mentally. You feel like you need to kill Faker and you have to make a play right now, and so you just press your button a little bit too fast, and it ends up being a really big problem. Beishuan has to settle in because this was a really bad game one in terms of tempo and in terms of execution, just about as bad as you could ever expect from him. I also think it's worth noting that Elk and On played the endgame horribly here on Kalista Renata. Elk was so far ahead on this Kalista and just got absolutely demolished in every single team fight. Super out of position, needs to be better than that. Knight tried his best to pull back some of this game on the Talia, but again, only so much you can do on that champion. I don't know why everybody thinks she's a late game team fighter. I just don't agree with that. Talia's good because of what she does in the mid game, not because of what she can do in the late game, and yet teams continue to invest into trying to get her to do that. I just don't think Kalista was the pick here. I think if you're going to play Poppy Talia, you need to go for a higher damage AD carry, because imagine if this was 3 kills on like Kaisa. You know, obviously the entire game shifts in that regard. All of a sudden BLG have a lot more avenues to stay in this than 3 kills on Kalista. Credit to Bin, was pretty good throughout the entire game. His entire team ran it down though, so you know, BLG now down 0-1. They need to be able to bounce back for game 2. Winning 3 in a row against T1 is nearly impossible, and so going down 0-2 would be an absolute nightmare for them. T1, though, for their credit, like they clearly feel settled in right now. They just need to be able to keep executing. They found the game plan to beat BLG. Just keep doing it. Don't, you know, mess with a formula that isn't broke. So we'll see if T1 can take that 2-0 lead or if BLG can tie up this series, because the winner of game number 2 was T1. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, and they are really dominating BLG right now, because the story of this game was almost identical to the story of game 1, where BLG had moments where it felt like they were getting into this game, where it felt like they could control things, but I think even more so than game number 1, T1 always felt like they were going to be able to weather the storm. It doesn't really matter what BLG threw at them. It always felt like T1 had an answer. I don't think that's because T1 was perfect in terms of not making mistakes. You have the owner Faker overstay to trade their lives for bot lane tier 1, which was completely unnecessary and quite frankly just a terrible play overall from both of them. You have certain moments throughout this game where Doran just completely runs it down at the beginning of the game, but all of that can add up to, it doesn't matter. Like the goal that they gave BLG in those instances, the bad plays that they made, it was never going to get punished because T1 was just going to be better at executing these late game situations, and quite frankly their late games actually look really good, and I think that is a good sign for the team moving forward. For BLG, I mean, how predictable can this team possibly get? There's almost nothing else left to say at this point. This team is what they are, and there's not really much else to go off of other than, yeah, they're good at, you know, taking advantage of early game mistakes, and the moment they have to do something with it in a 5v5, they're just not really all that good. They're a better version of G2. Like, that is just genuinely who BLG is right now, and that's just not a great place to be at, so let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Faker. I didn't even get into draft yet, but I think a big reason why Faker is getting player of the game here is because somehow, some way, he always manages to survive when he gets ganked. Like, the Faker global taunt is absolutely real. The amount of resources that BLG was consistently pumping into trying to kill this Victor was absolutely astounding, and yet it basically never worked. Like, there were only a few occasions, Faker obviously overstaying for that bot lane tier 1, like I already talked about. Also, he had to trade his life, I believe in another instance, for the rest of T1 to clean up the fight. Totally fine by me. Like, honestly, I think Faker was generally fine in this game. I think a lot of people are going to overrate how bad his bad plays were, and I think him being able to outplay a couple of 3v1 ganks to survive long enough for Doran or Carry, our owner, to show up is actually, you know, good gameplay. I don't think it's just T1 bailing Faker out of a bad situation. I think it's actively Faker eating up pressure and doing something with it. So, you know, Faker is player of the game, but getting into draft because I just skipped that entirely. My bad for going out of order. This draft, I think, is relatively T1 favored. I think BLG have a very clear window which they're supposed to win the game in the mid game. You're playing around the Wukong and the Annie, which obviously already wants to spike in the mid game because Annie wants to do that. Wukong can be a very stable teamfight engager, probably the most consistent in the game, but you don't really have a lot of other pieces for that. The Rumble can help there, but you have Annie Ezreal, again, as your carry duo. You're playing for mid game power spikes, specifically because you're playing into Caitlyn as well, and so Caitlyn is eventually going to get back online. She's obviously strong early, she's strong late, but you need to make sure that the Wukong can take advantage, and the Ezreal in particular can take advantage of the time periods where she's not all that strong. And I think that that was something that BLG did. I think they were able to kind of claw their way back into the game during the phase of the game where Guma was at his weakest, even though he had quite a bit of gold for T1. The problem is, in the 2 stages that they were supposed to lose the game, they actually did just straight up lose the game. Where T1 is at their strongest is early in the game, because Caitlyn obviously can do that. And also, I think Victor is a really good lane matchup in the mid lane into Annie. I think it's really difficult for Annie to actually be able to play this out, especially if Xin Zhao spends any time trying to play towards the Victor as well. And then I also think you eventually hit this point where you add scale because Caitlyn gets back online. The ornaments in particular really kind of push you over the edge, and Victor can be a primary damage dealer in team fights. You're kind of hoping to match with something like Rumble, but inevitably, like the Ornn gold that you're getting, like the free stats that you're getting with Ornn just kind of push you over the top in the late game if you are T1 in this instance. And that's kind of how the game ended up unfolding. Like there really weren't any surprises in terms of how these teams operate and how these drafts end up operating. And I think that's to the credit of T1. Like I said, player of the game is Faker, but I think you could reasonably give this to Doran as well in the top lane. If Doran had a human early game, I probably would have given it to him, but as per usual, he ends up being kind of a weak link in the early game and then making the biggest possible plays in the back half of the game. He got multiple player of the series over the course of the LCK regular season for me, if only just because, like, at the end of the game, he'll hit one Mbessa ult or one Ornn ult that just completely breaks open the game and wins it straight up for T1. He's done that like 4 or 5 times this year already. It happened again in this game. The big one, obviously, is Faker getting collapsed upon when he's pushing top tier 2, and then the rest of the team collapsing, Doran being behind everybody, hitting a 4-man Ornn ultimate and just instantly winning the game for T1. It was really impressive stuff, so credit to Doran. I just can't give him player of the game because his early game was not very good on the Ornn, but still was very useful in the back half. You know, Guma and Keria continue to be better as a bot lane duo, especially in comparison to Elkanon, who are making a ton of mistakes. Keria is very stable. Guma got a ton of gold in this game. I think, you know, it was obvious to me the moment that we came out of the second ban phase that Caitlyn was going to be the pick here. I'm not the biggest Caitlyn fan in the world, as anybody who follows the channel knows, but it is Guma's best champion, I think, for a lot of people, and so it's not surprising to see him pull it out and do so well on it in this one. And like I said, Keria was fine. Owner was fine. Owner made a couple of pretty big mistakes in this game, actually. I'm not just going to say that he was entirely fine. Had a big team fight at the end, but overall for T1, it's just one of those performances where they played exactly like they were supposed to, and they didn't really do too much or too little. They just won the game in the way that they needed to. And then for BLG, this team is so predictable, and it's honestly frustrating because they're predictable in a way that makes me, like, angry at them for playing the way that they do. They end up drafting a comp that spikes in the mid game, only being good in the mid game and not being able to play out any part of the rest of this game. Super frustrating stuff, and there were a couple of plays that were just horrible. There's the one dragon fight that really stands out where On ends up going in, immediately getting stunned in the Victor Gravity well and just dying instantly and just like insta-losing his team the fight. On is dead of the game, but Bin also in that same fight just completely whiffed an equalizer, and it's just like, man, what are we even doing right now? Like, what's even the point of this game if we're just going to, we're the hands team, like, where are the hands? Why is the team fighting so bad coming in from this team? It's really frustrating to see that, but On is clearly dead of the game. This Rel accomplished basically nothing throughout this entire game. On was so good domestically in the playoffs for BLG, a big reason why they're at this tournament in the first place, and his performances so far have just not been very good. I don't even think he was better than Alvaro in round number 1. Mostly because Alvaro was so good for Koi and just kind of, you know, wasn't as good as we saw earlier today. But On is now also letting his team down against T1. He's just not really had a great MSI so far. I think Elk is really lackluster in terms of his positioning and damage, and certainly Gumayushi is outplaying him. I think Knight didn't have the best game of all time, and he is just a hard champion for him to express a lot of his skill differences. And like we said, Bin, you know, even though he was doing well in the early game, missed equalizers in the back half of the game. The one part that you actually have to succeed on if you are the Rumble player. Beishuan's not having a very good series. It feels like he is like mentally disconnected. He's falling into the Faker global taunt trap where he's just trying to kill this guy over and over again. Usually teams at this level understand that this doesn't work against T1, but him having no international experience clearly is going for it over and over again, and they're getting punished for it. It's just, it looks like BLG's behind the 8 ball. It looks like they don't have the play style or the confidence to be able to go up against T1 right now, and it might just be a clean 3-0 sweep. I mean, T1 has just looked like they've had BLG's number. They clearly, like I said earlier, have the playbook on how to beat them. Are they going to be able to close this out in a sweep, or is BLG at the very least going to take one game off of T1? Well, the winner of game number 3 was T1. They are going to take game number 3. They are going to take this series in a clean 3-0 sweep, and they're going to decimate BLG. This was the closest game of the entire series, where it really did feel like BLG should have won this game throughout a lot of it, but they just didn't have the execution to actually end things at the end. Knight was mega fed and was playing super well for BLG for a majority of this game, but it was really T1's macro that completely outpaced BLG's terrible macro, and that's really what the big difference-making, you know, plays were. They were all centered around macro things that T1 just did better than BLG, and I think that really is the takeaway from this series, is that BLG is unfortunately everything that everyone thought they were, which is a good early game team that cannot play late game situations or team fights or setups at all. Like, they're just not a team. They are 5 really good players, 4.5 really good players, shut up H1. They are 4.5 really good players and nothing else, and I think that that is a bit disappointing for what BLG can be moving forward. But for T1, They are leveling up. This is the best they played all year. I don't want to hear it in the comment section where people are like, oh, you know, T1's always been this throughout this year. You actually just weren't watching T1. You weren't respecting how good they were. This team had a 10K gold deficit to Nongshim Red Force like a month ago. I'm not going to sit here and take that, man. This team lost to both Bro and Fear X like 2 months ago. This is not a team that has shown this the entire year. I promise you, this is not the T1 we've gotten, but they are coming out again at an international tournament. And you know what, T1 fans? You can thank me because I put them 4th in my power rankings, which is a historical, proven way to get T1 to win an international tournament. Always, every single time I put them below the 2nd seed from the LPL in any context, they win. They just always do it. It's crazy how consistent they are in that regard. So honestly, really, I deserve the credit. But jokes aside, obviously, I just overrated BLG. I'm happy to admit that I was wrong here. This was not close. T1 is absolutely better than BLG, and that was very clear in this series. And I think it comes down to a lot of things. So we can talk about draft here. The drafts are kind of even. I think all things considered, both of these teams want to play through mid-game, and I don't think either necessarily have a gigantic lead over the other inherently. I think BLG need to play through the middle of the map. This is an Ahri game, like through and through. This is a Vi Ahri game through and through. I don't think Zaya's going to be in a great spot because Gragas can't really facilitate a good laning phase for her against Varus, and I think Mbessa's really going to struggle in this game. I do not think this is a very good Mbessa game. It's going to be difficult to find any sort of priority target on the backline without immediately getting peeled, and also Mbessa is a champ that, at least from my perspective, kind of needs to win lane, and I just don't think she can do that into Renekton, so I think it really is up to the Vi Ahri. Luckily, the Ahri played really well here, but for T1, I think their advantages are elsewhere. Not only can you use the Realm Warp in the late game, even if Ryze is behind, which, by the way, we'll talk about it. What was Faker doing for the first 15 minutes of this game? I mean, truly, he was limit testing to every degree, but the Varus is in a great spot in this game. I think the Renekton is actually in a great spot to be able to take over late game team fights, because if you can get onto Ahri, like, the fight's just over. There's not really a lot else that BLG can do. I know that Zaya getting fed is theoretically an out for them. I just have a hard time believing that's ever going to happen with these two drafts, and so you're sitting in a spot where Varus and Renekton are both going to be in great situations, and owners should have a lot of priority to be able to walk up. There's not a ton of burst damage coming out to threaten the Skarner in the back half of this game, especially if Keria ends up playing aggressive as well, which creates more options for T1. Again, I'm not saying this was unwinnable for BLG. I think playing through Ahri Vi is a foolproof way of being good in the mid game and maybe winning a game. I think we've seen that throughout the entirety of this year, but I think T1's win conditions were a tad bit more stable just because I trust Varus more than Ahri in the back half of the game right now, and that's kind of what we saw pay off. Gumayushi's my player of the game for game number 3. His Varus, honestly, his entire series was super underrated. He was really good in this series. His positioning was near perfect. I think his gameplay was really solid. His damage output, very consistent. The fact that he's getting Varus on R1, like on red side in game number 3 of Fearless, like, what are we doing, man? Why are we trading Vi for Varus? Like, how was that a fair trade overall? In my opinion, I think Varus is just way too strong. He's the best AD carry in the game by far, and I think we've been proven that at this tournament, and yet teams still kind of think otherwise and think other different ways. Twisted Fate is still receiving blue side bans every game, and so clearly I'm stupid. Like, clearly I'm the one who's dumb and doesn't understand things, but Gumayushi was awesome in this series. I think he has really found his form. He started to level back up. You know, that was already the case, I would say, in the quote-unquote playoffs, but I think it's really become the case here at MSI. Same thing for Keria. He was awesome in this series, and he's been awesome at this tournament. He was great in the playoffs as well, but it's cool to see that form carry over. But player of the series, I mean, come on, man. It's Faker in the mid lane. I don't care that he sprinted it for the entire early game in game 3. Was this guy sitting at 1-4 looking like he was actively going to lose his team the game? Yeah, he was. He face-checked a couple of brushes and just instantly died, played super greedy, gave no respect over to BLG, basically gave Knight his entire lead, and then he realm warped twice into the Baron pit, which like won T1 the game. Obviously, they've made this play a ton over the course of the last year or so. This is not something that, you know, T1 fans are going to be surprised to see. They do this quite a bit in the LCK when they do have Ryze available to them, but it's still huge to see Faker be able to play the map well in the back half of this game, and he recovered pretty well from being the worst player on the Rift in the first 15 minutes. I just can't give him player of the game for game 3. He is getting player of the series, though, because I think he was too important in game 1. He really was excellent in game 1, and he also was great in game 2, and he was kind of the main character of this series in terms of where a lot of the pressure was. So, you know, argue with the wall if you think that that's a little bit different. Doran was also really important in this series. He ends up getting the crucial crucial flank onto Knight in that final team fight. Credit to Durant. Again, he is like the king of coin flippers. Like, there's honestly nothing else left to say about this guy. He's going to shit the bed in the first 10 minutes of the game and then, you know, make the biggest team fight play you've ever seen in your entire life. It's actually just crazy how consistent it is for him to make those plays. Owner was solid in this series. I don't think he was exceptional. I think he's probably going to get a bit overhyped for his gameplay here, but still, he was fine. And then, like I said, bot lane was specifically excellent here in game number 3. So nice win for T1 and a bad loss for BLG. Not only is it a 3-0, but it's like, yeah, you just are a weak team in this area of the game, and you're going to get punished by good teams over and over again in that regard. It's really disappointing to see because Knight played incredible in game 3. Best game of the series from any player on BLG for sure was Knight on the Ahri. He just couldn't carry it. There were a couple of fights where he didn't play perfect. I'm not going to sit here and say that he was like the best player on the Rift in this game or anything, but I do think that there was a lot of onus on him to carry the game, and the rest of his team really let him down. Specifically this top side. Bin's gonna get dud of the game. What happened, man? Why would you ult into the backline as Mbessa during this Baron dance and immediately kill yourself to allow your Ahri to just get perma-killed in the end of the fight? Like, it's impatience, and it's a frustrating mistake that Bin normally wouldn't make, and I don't really know. Maybe it's the T1 buff. I just can't really explain it. Beishuan looked mega gapped this entire series. Again, I think it was very clear that this was his first time playing against T1 and Faker and these big names because he was going for the flashy plays and he was clearly, you know, nervous. Like, there's nothing else to say. It was very obvious that this guy was incredibly nervous in these games, and he just can't play like that when you're going up against some of the best teams in the world. Elk and On were also kind of bad. On in particular had a horrible series. I think the one saving grace was the Gragas ult that ended up kind of pulling this game back a bit for BLG in the mid game, but outside of that, like, On was really, really shit in a lot of these team fights. Elk, I think, was super behind the 8 ball in terms of going up against Gumayusi. It just felt like BLG was worse everywhere, and I think that's a really bad sign. I don't know, man. This team's going down to the lower bracket. They have to face off against a team in FlyQuest that is basically like the worst possible matchup in the world for them, a team that's really good at delaying games and playing for late games and has great macro in general. I don't know, man. BLG's in a little bit of danger here. I'm not going to try and overreact. We'll talk about that in the bracket, but this is a nice win for T1. Moving on to winners finals is fantastic. This guarantees them top 3 at the tournament as well, regardless of what happens throughout the rest of this. But I don't know, man. Is T1 getting a buff that's big enough to win the entire tournament? I think it's realistic. This was a team that just a month or two ago was talked about like, well, they're certainly not making MSI. I hope they can level up and start to be competitive going into the world circuit. Now they might win MSI. Gen G's been a little bit shakier than people want them to be at this tournament, even if I don't agree with that. That series against AL was really, really good. I think TL are still, or T1, not TL, T1 are still underdogs going into winners finals, but they always seem to figure it out. Who knows if this year is going to be any different? All right, but that is going to do it for my MSI Round 2, Day 2 overview and analysis video. It's time to get into the rest of this tournament. Now we know our winners finals matchup, Gen G versus T1. Not previewing that today. We also know Bilibili taking on FlyQuest is going to be a very fun lower bracket series. Also not previewing that here today because our next series that we are covering and the next series that's happening is, after a day off, Anyone's Legend taking on the CTBC Flying Oysters. And this is probably the least interesting of the 3 that are left because I think there is one clear favorite, but shout out the Flying Oysters for making it this far. It's already been super impressive to see that they are guaranteed a top 6 team at this tournament, and honestly, they've earned all the praise that they're getting, and maybe they can make this series closer than people are expecting, but at least for now, it's really hard to predict this series being anything other than AL 3-0. I think they looked great against Gen G, a Gen G team that did show up on the day. AL was incredible. They just weren't as good as Gen G, the best team in the world. I think there's a very real chance that AL is making it to the finals to take on Gen G once more. That would be my prediction right now, and so I don't think the Oysters are going to be able to stand in the way of that. I don't think they're better in any role, but Junja has experience, you know, playing against players like Tarzan pretty regularly. You never really know. Maybe the Oysters can take a game or two and make things really interesting like they did against T1. I just think AL is a better team than T1, and I think they are going to be able to clean up this series pretty easily in a 3-0. Let me know if you agree or disagree down in the comment section below, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We're covering every other series, the rest of MSI as per usual, and we're going back to 1 series per day, so these videos are going to get even more in-depth on those games. If you're excited for that content, hit subscribe, hit that bell, so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all